Bava METZIA Daf Yomi BAVA, moral conscience. Lo yetzeh yedei chovato ad shieshalem. We'll learn an understanding that moral conscience is not a humanistic principle. Sometimes we have legal obligations and then we have moral obligations. That doesn't mean a humanistic morality. That moral conscience is something that stems from an understanding of Hashem's world and what Hashem expects from us. It's something which it comes from an awareness of the divine, as we'll see. I want to remind particularly those people who have joined the Matmonim more recently that the purpose of the Matmonim is just to touch on one idea in every daf, just to give you an idea of what lies under any line on the daf. We just happen to choose one because we've only got a short amount of time and people have only got a short attention span. So we just pick one thing and we spend 20 minutes on one idea, but you could do it on any line of the Gemara. It doesn't matter where you stop and decide to go deeper. And to learn how to extract from the lomdus, from the technical detail of the piece of Gemara, to understand life-changing insights and enlightenment that can give one a sense of the world that is different and important. During the month of June, I'll be in the United States for most of the month, and we're going to try to arrange for chaburas in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, where I'll be during that time. So if anybody's interested, if you would either let me know or the people who will organize it. In New York, it'll be my son Moshe. In Washington, it'll be that Silver Spring, it'll be my son-in-law Jared. And in Los Angeles, it'll be my son-in-law Eitan. There are three halachot three principles that we're going to work with today. The one is the principle of tefiso. There are times when a beis din, a court of law, cannot execute on a judgment. They cannot enforce payment of an amount from a defendant to a claimant. But what happens if the claimant grabs it from the defendant without the permission of the beis din? And he says, this is mine. I understand the beis din were unable to get sufficient evidence to decide in my favor and to force the defendant to pay me, but I've taken the law into my own hands. Now I've got it. I'm the muhzak. Sometimes we force him to return what he took, and sometimes we don't. That's itofis, whether mafkinan minei or not. It's called tfisa. A person grabs something which there's been a court case about, he's claimed it, he's got a right to it, but the beis din were unable to fully find in his favor. The second idea we're talking about, which we've had many times before, is kimle midrabe minei, that when the beis din decides that there are two consequences for a person's action, one a very severe one, one a less severe one, we only execute on the severe one. So if a person did something that involves a death sentence, let's say, and in addition to that, there's a financial obligation as well, which he owes, we don't make him do both. We give him the death sentence, but he doesn't pay we don't force him to pay the financial amount. And the third idea is the idea of latzeit yedei shomayim, that sometimes one isn't obligated to do something from a technical legal perspective. There's no legal claim, but latzeit yedei shomayim, if you want to do the right thing by Hashem, then one needs to be able to, one should do so. Those are the three principles that we're going to work with, and we're going to deal with a conversation of 1,000 years. This is just one of those again, where you just, from time to time, just to remind you of what's actually happening here. That the most unbelievable wisdom, wise people, Gedolei Yisrael, tzaddikim, people of unbelievable stature, join our Beis HaMedrash. They come in while we're sitting here each morning, and they talk to each other. And they invite us to listen in. And they talk to each other over a span of 1,000 years, starting with Rava in the Gemara with the most brilliant comment. And for 1,000 years, there's a conversation explaining and understanding what Rava said. And we'll see that 1,000-year conversation. It involves Rashi. And don't forget, Rashi is a talmid of the talmidim, and we'll see in this Rashi where he quotes one of his rabbeim. His three primary rabbeim are talmidim of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom is the link between the period of the Gaonim, after the Gemara, and the period of the Rishonim. And then we've got Rashi. And then we've got Rashi's grandchildren and the whole school of the Tosfos, and we come to the Or Zarua, who we'll have today. The Or Zarua is learnt with the great Balei Tosfos at the end of the Tosfos period, and he was the Rebbe of the Maram Rutenberg. The Maram Rutenberg is the Rebbe of the Rosh, whose son, the Tur, sets up the Shulchan Aruch, which we use until today. So the Or Zarua, although you don't hear of him all that much, a very important link in the chain of tradition, all the way through from the Balei Tosfos through to the Shulchan Aruch. And then we've got the Rivosh. The Rivosh is 14th century. He was in Spain, and then he fled to Algiers, and he published an enormous number of terribly important Shuvot responsa, which the Beis Yosef draws on a lot. Rabbi Yosef Karo draws on it and uses it in the Shulchan Aruch. We've got the Marshal, who's from the time of the Shulchan Aruch, is the time of the Rabbi Yosef Karo, and a colleague of the Ramah. So he's in that 16th century period. And the Shach in the 17th century, who explains the Yerodeh and the Choshen Mishpat, the parts of the Shulchan Aruch that we're referring to. So all of these people are involved in this unbelievable concept, all based on the same pasuk we had yesterday, Lo tachsom shor b'disho, that you can't muzzle an ox while you're working with it in the field. So we have a case here where a person rents an ox from somebody else, and he uses it in the field, and he muzzles the ox. So the ox doesn't eat. Then he gives the ox back to the owner. So now the owner has to feed the ox. The ox hasn't eaten the whole day. And this person has done an avera. He's used an ox, he's worked with an ox that was muzzled. So he gets malchus for that, but there's also a financial obligation to the owner. Because I should have allowed your ox to eat my grain. And I didn't allow him to eat the grain. I muzzled him. So now you have to feed him grain. You have a claim. So the Gemara is lokeh u'mishalem. He gets malkot and he has to pay. And the Gemara goes on and says, but we don't do that. We don't give a severe payment and a severe punishment and a light punishment. And we have three answers for that. We have Abaya, we have Rava, and we have Rav Papa. We're only going to deal with Rava. Rava Amar etnan asra Torah va'afilu ba'alimo. That's all Rava said. Imagine you're going to a shir. Rava is giving the shir. Topic of the shir, Bava Metzia Daf Tzadi from Aleph. The topic is Hachosem et hapara v'dash ba lokeh u'mishalem. That's the topic. What's the shir? The shir lasts not 20 minutes like our shir, but the shir lasts for 20 seconds. Rava gets up and he says, if you're worried about what the pshat is, why you have to pay and get malchus, I'll explain to you. Etnan asra Torah va'afilu ba'alemo, and he sits down, end of the shir. And it's a mind-blowing shir, as you're going to see. He says something which seems to be completely unrelated. There's a din that if a person, chas v'sholom, pays a prostitute, then the money that he pays to her or the gift he gave her cannot be used in hekdesh. You can't bring it to the Beis HaMikdash. It's disgusting to the Beis HaMikdash. What happens if the prostitute turns out to have been the man's mother? God forbid, a weird case. So now he's done a terrible avera. There's a death sentence for this. But she's also got a financial claim. She says, okay, my son, you're going to be executed, that's fine, I get it, but you owe me, you haven't paid yet. It's weird, I mean, you've got to laugh at such a weird situation, but that's what we're dealing with. That's all Rava says. The din is that even if the prostitute was his mother, he's still not allowed to use the etnan for the Beis HaMikdash. What does he mean? So Rashi explains Rava's shir and says, what you see from here is an amazing idea, that even though he's going to be executed, so there is no financial obligation. If she were to come to Beis Din, imagine that scene, she comes to Beis Din in Yerushalayim, you've got these tzaddikim sitting on the Beis Din, and this woman comes up, she says, I have a claim. My son used me as a prostitute, and he won't pay me. And they say, but of course not, because he's going to be executed. She says, but I want my money. The Beis Din doesn't give her the money. But says Rava, it's still called an etnan. And if he does give it to her, willingly, he can't bring it to the Beis HaMikdash because it has the name etnan. It's considered a gift to a prostitute. But why? It's not. She doesn't have any claim on it. It's just a stam. It's a gift. It's a gift of a son to a mother. It's not payment to a prostitute. Says Rava, you see from there that even when you don't have to pay, if you do pay, that's considered payment. That's not considered a gift. So the obligation to pay remains even if you don't have a legal obligation to pay. And therefore, says Rashi, V'gabi Chosem Nami, explaining Rava's shiur. What did Rava mean? Tashlumin Rabu Ale. In the case of the muzzled ox that he rented from his friend, he owes his friend the money. Ela she'en koach beveit din le'onsho shtayim. But the Beis Din doesn't have the authority to punish him double, to punish him twice. To say you get malkot for muzzling your ox, and you've got to pay the owner of the ox what you denied him by not feeding his ox. We can only give you one punishment, so you're going to get malchus, and we cannot enforce the payment to the owner of the ox. But the fact is, there was still an obligation. There is an obligation to pay. It's just based in say we can't enforce it. It's an unenforceable obligation. And therefore, lo yatsa yedei chovato ad sheyeshalem. Doesn't fulfill his moral obligation until he pays. That means a man can go to Beis Din, and Beis Din can say, you get malkut, you don't pay. There's no enforceable obligation. And when he comes after 120 years in Hashem's court of law, and Hashem judges him and says, but you owe your friend, you never paid your friend the money that you deprived him of by not feeding his ox. Says the man, but I went to Beis Din. There were big tzaddikim on the Beis Din. They said, I don't have to pay. Says the Ribbono Shel Olam, you don't have to pay him, but in my book, you still owe him the money. In the court of law, you don't owe him the money. But in my book, you owe him the money and you never paid him. That's what Latzet Yedei Shomayim means. There are times where if you ask a Shaila, if you ask the Beis Din, if you ask the Rov, the answer will be you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay doesn't mean that you have no obligation. You still have an obligation. It's Latzet Yedei Shomayim. Inami, and furthermore, Itafis lo mafkinan mineh. Also, since there's no legal obligation, but there is a moral obligation, asks Rashi, what happens if the defendant grabs the money and says, I'm not okay, I understand you're getting 39 stripes for what you did, that's your business, between you and God. But at the end of the day, you still owe me the money that you deprived by not feeding my ox, and he grabs the money. He takes the money. Do we take the money back from him or not, says Rashi? No, because there's a moral obligation. Although there's not a legal obligation, there is a moral obligation. Kach shamati mipi mori hazoken. I heard this from my older Rebbe. Rashi had three important Rabbeim. Two Rabbeinu Yitzchoks and one Rabbeinu Yaakov. And Rabbeinu Yaakov is the one most people assume that he's referring to when he says mipi mori hazoken, from my older Rebbe. That's what he taught me. That's why this is so important. So Rashi, using the Torah of his Rebbe, expands this little shir that Rava gave, which is a major chidush. And that is that even though there's no legal obligation, the moral obligation sits upon you, and that money morally belongs to the other party. Legally it belongs to you, and morally it belongs to somebody else. That splitting up of ownership to legal ownership and moral ownership was the chidush of Rava, the innovation of Rava, which Rashi explains. And this is paskened by the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua, as I mentioned, a really important link in the chain of Halacha, brought in the Hagos Hashri, in the Rosh, where he says, V'itofas lo mafkinan mineh. In this case, if he grabs it, you don't take it away from it. So what is the principle? Where there's no legal obligation, but there is a moral obligation, if the defendant takes the money that he's morally entitled to, but not legally entitled to, we leave it with the defendant. We don't make the defendant give it back, because morally it belongs to him. That's how Rashi concludes. The Rivosh throws a spanner in the works. The Rivosh is, as I said to you, this great posek. We have these wonderful tshuvas. And in a long, long tshuva on Avak Ribis in Shin Tzadi Beis, it's a long tshuva. Towards the end of it, he throws just in passing that Ein tfisa mo'elet b'meh she'ein lo bo zchut elo b'val letzeit yedei shomayim. If there's only a moral obligation, you cannot grab, and if you do grab, you have to give it back. That's against the Rashi. That's against the Or Zarua. The Rivosh is 14th century. And here he's passing against those who came before him. Where does this come from? Where does he get it from? It's against the Rashi. So the Marshal answers the difficulty. The Marshal, the Rov in Krakow, as I said, is part of that whole group. The Ramor, the Marshal, incredibly important. The author of the Yam Shel Shlomo writes, V'nireh kol heichad amrinan chayev b'dinei shamayim itofas mafkinan mineh. Says the Marshal, the same as the Rivosh. Where there is only a moral obligation, so Beis Din says, we can't force you to pay. The defendant grabs the money. Beis Din said, well, what can we do? He's grabbed the money, can he keep it? Says the Marshal, no, he has to give it back. Again, against Rashi, against the Or Zarua. But he's repeating what the Rivosh says. And then he says, Afilu leperush Rashi, but this works even according to Rashi on Daf Tzadi Aleph in Bava Metzia. So he asks, he's bothered by the same question that we're bothered by, and he answers by beautifully differentiating two different types of moral obligation. There is a moral obligation which stems from the inability of Beis Din, of the court of law, to execute. You owe it to him, but we can't enforce it because we're giving you malchus, and we're not allowed to give you two punishments. But there was a legal obligation, and there kind of still is, but we can't enforce it, so it remains a moral obligation. In such a case, if the defendant takes it, he's taking something that he had a legal obligation to. Now, because of a technical problem, he loses he has a legal right to it. Now, because of a technical problem, he loses his legal right, but he retains the moral right. In such a situation, lo mafkina mineh, we don't take it back from him. However, there are some cases where he never had a legal obligation to pay. For example, the case that we're dealing with there in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Kaf Ches, we're talking about a person who knows evidence. You're involved in a court case. I have evidence that could save you, but I don't want to get involved. I stay away. I don't come to court. That's kovesh ha'idus. It's an isur d'oraisa. It's a law against the Torah, and I'm indirectly causing you damage. In such a case, potu midine adam v'chayiv midine shamayim. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that you're obligated in the court of law of Hashem. You've decided not to go to court. That's fine. Nobody can claim against me. If you land up losing in court, you can't then take me to court and say, you caused my loss, because if you would have come to Beis Din as a witness, I wouldn't have lost. That's groma, that's indirect damage, and you can't have such a claim. But when you come to Shamayim after 120 years, Hashem will have a claim. That's a moral obligation. Here, says the Marshal, there never was a legal obligation. This was only a moral obligation. There always was only a moral obligation. And the same with Avak Ribis in the case of the Rivosh. There's only a moral obligation. There never was a legal obligation where it's interest according to the Rabbanon but not according to the Torah. Avak Ribit, we call it, as we had in Ezer and Esher. In such a situation where there never was a legal obligation, only a moral obligation, if the other person grabs it, we do take it back from him. He has no right to grab it. Even though morally you're responsible, even though morally you should pay. Even though when you come to Shamayim, Hashem will say, I have a problem with you. Why did you not pay your friend? And you'll say, because I had no legal obligation. Hashem will say, but still you had an obligation by me. You should have paid him. And in such a case, if the person grabs it, we're not going to take it. We're going to take it back from him because he had no legal obligation at all. So this is the brilliant separation by the Marshal of these two types of obligation, of moral obligation. One is a moral obligation resulting from the fact that Beis Din has no power to execute. The other is a moral obligation because there never was a legal obligation. But in both cases, there's a moral obligation. In the one case, if the defendant grabs it, we'll take it from him. In the other case, if the defendant grabs it, we won't take it from him. And that's how we understand Rashi, who's explaining Rova. And this is the 1,000-year conversation to understand the 22nd shiur of Rova in Babylon. And we see how important it is to live this dual life. We live a physical life in this world where there are rights and there are obligations and there are laws, and we live a life where we're responsible to Hashem at the same time. Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. Hashem is always in front of me. That means when I want to decide whether something is right or wrong, I don't just look up the Shulchan Aruch, look up the law. I look at Hashem in the face and I say, what would Hashem want me to do? Hashem is with me all the time. I have these conversations with Hashem. And that guides me as to what is right and what is wrong. We learned in the Medrash here on Shabbat, the idea of Hashem and Eliyahu and the Mashiach being your audience, being the people who judge you and who recognize you living in that world simultaneously with the physical world in which we live. I've told you before, I might have told you before, once I was in Rome and there was a big crowd in a square and I wanted to take a photograph from above, so I stood on a ledge. And a policeman was there in a second with a rifle pointing at me. He said, get off the ledge, what are you doing? I said, it doesn't say anywhere I can't stand on the ledge. He said, are you an American? Do you need a sign to tell you that you can't stand on the ledge when there's so many people standing around? Can you not see that it's dangerous? What a limud, what he taught me. We don't always have to have a law for everything. There's a latzet yedei shamayim. Use your own moral logic to understand what's right and what's wrong. In America, it's become a very litigious society where if I can find a way around the law to say, I don't owe you, I'm not responsible, not my fault, we find those legal loopholes and the lawyers spend their lives doing that. Doesn't work for a ben Torah. For a ben Torah, yes, we have legal obligations which we have to abide by. But we have another whole set of moral obligations which come not from humanistic rights of one person to another, but from the divine expectations, the Rebbeinu Shem's expectations of how a Jew is meant to behave.